Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to another live session at the Reactors. My name is Rav and I'm the program manager here at Reactor London. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful, kind, and considerate. The chat is going to be open and we do encourage you all to participate. Today is the 8th episode of our 10 Tuesdays to Azure Fundamentals series. If you have missed the previous episodes, I'm going to actually put a link in the chat. So make sure you go back and look at all of the previous videos. This session, we'll be talking all about Azure Cloud Governance tools and services. We'll also be in the middle of the session or towards the end, Johan will also talk about the vouchers, the exam vouchers. So make sure you stick around so you know you can get the code for today. And with that, I am now going to put Johan back on the screen. Hi, Johan.
Hello. How's it going, everyone? I hope everyone's had a great day and a great week. Welcome to episode number 8 of our 10 days to Azure Fundamentals. Keep in mind that what we are doing here is we're trying to prepare you for the Azure Fundamentals exam, which is a certification that actually doesn't expire, so it's well worth doing the certification. Like all our other fundamentals certifications, they don't expire, so it's not like our role-based certifications that you have to renew after a year and after 2 years rewrite the exam. So we're trying to prep you for that. Thanks, Rav, for the introduction, as usual. And you'll notice that towards the bottom of the screen here, we've got, there's a link, AZ900 EP8LM, and that'll take you through to the actual content relating to the certification exam. I'll click through on that in a moment. But before that, let me just quickly go through an introduction. My name is Johan Meiberg. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK. Originally from South Africa. I enjoy water sports and sharing knowledge with people. I'm pretty passionate about that. I've got my credentials there, like, some of the certifications I've got, but also my email address, my Twitter handle that I'm starting to push out some content again, go through phases there. And then, of course, my LinkedIn profile, right? So you're welcome to hook up with me. I live just outside of London. I'm looking for some community work to do, as per usual. I'm going to head back here, and I'm just briefly going to click on this link, and I want to show you that what this is actually going to do is it's going to take you through to describe the features and tools for Azure governance and compliance, and you'll notice that I can then hit the continue button, and it'll essentially take me through, everything related to this. This is the specific item that we're looking at today, governance compliance. So we will focus in some detail on Azure Blueprints, Azure Policy, resource locks, and the Service Trust Portal. I'm not going to spend too much time on the Service Trust Portal. Suffice to say, Microsoft.com, which this will take me through to the Service Trust Portal. And in here, you can actually get some information, GDPR information if you're looking at compliance, right? Down from there, you'll see, GDPR information and Cosmos DB, right? And I can go and save this to my personal library. I have to sign in here first. But the Service Trust Portal is going to give you a great overview of how you might use Azure to stay compliant with all those sort of compliance standards. There you can see FedRAMP, PCI, ISO, IEC, for example, and a whole bunch of additional options in there as well. White papers, some artifacts. It really is a great sort of a tool for you to get going in the Azure space. So that is all of that is basically rolled up there in the learn.microsoft.com platform. And what we'll be looking at today, as I mentioned, is we'll look at first get an understanding of why governance is important. And then secondly, we will look at policy. I'm going to touch a little bit on role-based access control just because I think it's important in rolling into blueprints. And then we'll talk about blueprints, what it is, and then we'll talk about resource locks towards the end of that. Okay, so Why governance, right? And if you come from a large enterprise environment, maybe something like a bank, you're probably not even going to get asked the question, right? You're not going to go like, why governance? The reality is, the bigger your Azure footprint, the more important governance becomes, because governance is going to bring tools to the party and to the table that will ensure you that your environment is configured and the life cycle of your service is essentially managed in a way that's compliant with whatever you need to be compliant with, right? Smaller organizations might not have a massive amount of compliance and governance risk involved, but the bigger the organization, the more compliance risk you might run into. So governance is going to essentially define these rules for your operating environment, for operating your resources inside of Azure, and you want to build this into your process. Now, if you are doing software development in your organization and you're deploying applications into the Azure environment, what we mean by this is you really want to take this kind of to the next level and say, but if we are deploying resources, why not automatically deploy the governance resources alongside that, as opposed to doing that as an afterthought, right? What you want to avoid, at least, is a scenario whereby you realize 6 months in that you had these tools at your exposure and you weren't using them, right? Which means it affected your cost, these sort of things. So without governance, you end up with quite a bit of sprawl, and I've spoken about sprawl before on one of the earlier episodes. Sprawl is where someone goes and creates a virtual machine for testing purposes or demo purposes or for whatever reason, and before you know it, you've got 3 or 4 virtual machines that are running, or even not running, but they are there, taking up resources in your environment, and you're paying for them, and no one even knows what they are for, right? It's so easy to provision resources in a cloud scenario and setup like in Azure, that sprawl is a big deal, right? It's something that we have to come to grips with. How do we prevent this from happening? How do we know that the resources that are running and being managed in our environment are resources that we actually need today and that they are not unnecessary? Second thing is consistency. Without proper governance, you'll find that 5 different administrators provision virtual machines. Each of those administrators take a different approach in provisioning virtual machines. One of them might use PowerShell. The other one might use the Azure CLI. The other one just uses the portal. And when the minute that happens, you'll find that there's going to be inconsistency with regards to the size of the virtual machine, right? The different SKUs that you are using for things like app services, right? The regions that you are deploying to. What are the rules behind, storage accounts, for example? Are we going to have regional redundancy and set up our replication like that? All of those things become inconsistent if you don't have a proper governance sort of, plan in place, and if you're not using the tools we'll be talking about to actually govern your environment. The second thing that really talks a lot to the sprawl I spoke about earlier on is cost, right? The minute people get to choose their own size virtual machines, if you don't have a firm sort of plan in place on what those sizes of those virtual machines need to be, just as an example, you end up paying double for these resources, and for these resources you pay half of what you might be paying for, but they're running at they're flatlining in terms of their usage, and you're not really getting your applications to run properly, right? So one thing you want to avoid is having each person that deploys resources decide on the given day how and in what configuration they're going to be deploying those resources, because it's one of the main factors that affect cost in the cloud setup. Of course, security is also at one of the key concerns. The minute you've got inconsistency, your attack surface might look slightly different. If things are configured in the same way and things go wrong, you might have one problem to solve. But if there are 10 virtual machines, for example, and they're each configured in a different way and things go wrong, you've got potentially 10 problems you need to solve. So keeping things consistent, keeping things configured and managed in the same consistent way, keeping those deployments in the same configuration is going to eventually also help you to reduce your attack surface and make your environment more secure. And last but not least, loose cannons. I've come across this many times over the years. Often I'm a loose cannon myself, like thinking, well, I want to do this now, but it's stopping me from doing it. But if I do it like this, it's going to allow me to do it. So I do it like that, and I just leave it in a certain way, right? A good example of this is some time ago, we had a scenario whereby my subscription in Azure was not allowing me to provision app service plans for whatever reason with a certain SKU. I realized that if I just create the service plan with a lower level SKU that's going to cost a little bit cheaper initially, it allowed me to do it, and it allowed me to change the plan later on to the more expensive plan. Once I realized my subscription allowed me to do that, I was like, whoa, hang on for a second. I can get away with this. And I just kept, provisioning my app services like this. So loose cannons also sometimes make mistakes, right? Oh, what is this? We don't need this. Hit the delete button, right? So with governance, you might reduce the amount of admin permissions that they might have, and you can use some of the tools to stop things like that happening by accident. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So one of the most important tools that we've got in Azure for governance is policies. So what is an Azure policy? Azure policies are granular rules that you can apply to your Azure structure. Now, if you remember what we spoke about with regards to the Azure structure was management groups at the higher level. And under the management groups, I might have some subscriptions scattered around the management groups. And under the subscriptions, I might have some resource groups, right, which contain my eventual resources. Policies are rules that we can apply to that structure that will inherit down and that will stop certain things from either being deployed, or that will report back and tell us, oh, these resources are not compliant. You can see there that I've only got non-compliant resources in this diagram at the bottom here, right? Pretty sad state of affairs. Maybe I did that by purpose. I don't think I actually did. So let's quickly pull up my Azure policy here. So this is the Azure policy portal, and you'll notice here that I got some serious problems here. Some of these are from the security benchmark, so there's definitely some security issues here. But if I click on View All, then it actually shows me exactly which resources and what areas in my Azure implementation are non-compliant, right? Some of them are compliant, some of them are not compliant. If I scroll down, you will see there's a pretty big list of that. So if I click on definitions on the left-hand side here, you will see that these are essentially a list of all the policy definitions I've got. You don't have to just use these policy definitions that you see here. All of these were most of these actually were built-in policies that I got with my Azure subscription. But failing this, if I click on new policy definition, you will notice that we've even got some samples on GitHub that we can actually go and build on. So there you can see there's some samples. And you'll find some samples here on GitHub relating to almost any sort of service inside of Azure. There's Cosmos DB, the Key Vault, monitoring, networking, right? SQL Server, tags, right? Text patterns, some of the built-in policies, right? I can go for data lake, some automation policies. Whichever policies I might want to go and bring in here, I can come in here and I can tweak them. Now you'll see that currently I cracked open one of them called, I'll just scroll to the top here, called location. In fact, let me just Let me open up one of them. There you can see there's a policy called VM locations. This, by the way, is a custom policy that I created. So this policy was existing in my environment, but I tweaked it slightly, and I gave it a new name, VM locations in brackets there, deny, as you can see there, right? So it's actually categorized according to production VM locations. I'm just going to bump the font slightly for you here so you can see my screen a bit better. We are not planning to put off the camera, so I hope that you can see my screen quite well here. We've got some feedback that the camera works for some people. All right, so you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of them here, right? So if I go, for example, and type in the word size here, then you will see, shows me, allowed virtual machine size SKUs. There's some options regarding, sort of the key vault, etc. If I click on allowed virtual machine size SKUs, it will essentially give me the Azure policy that shows me the definition that I can apply to an area in my structure that either allows or does not allow certain size virtual machines, right? So how can I implement this? I can click on the assign button. I can specify my scope, right? And you'll notice that I've got my training subscription there, for example. In fact, let's go for something like Dev, just as an example. And I can be quite specific in terms of my management group, my subscription, or even down to my resource group level where I want to apply this policy, and I can go and hit the select button. This will essentially take this policy and scope it at that level, and it will then inherit down. I can also, by the way, specify certain exclusions, right? So for example, I might have a policy that only allows certain virtual machine sizes, right? And I might have a resource group where I want to ignore that policy for just that resource group. So I can now go and specify, my 204 resource group, and I can add it to the selected scope. And that means this policy will apply in that structure, but I am going to ignore this policy just for that resource group. So this is I'm not going to do that actually, but this is a great way for me to not only apply the policy to a certain scope, but to say, but in this area, we are not really sure if we want this policy to be applied, and we can then exclude the policy from a certain part of the structure, right? So just a little bit more granular control. There you can see a proper description, stop VMs from using these different sizes, right? My word, I didn't even make a typo there. Actually did. And you'll notice that I can specify whether the policy must be enforced or not. I can hit the next button, and you'll notice now it's actually prompting me for different resources. I can add some overrides. If I hit the next button here, you'll notice that it's prompting me now for the virtual machine sizes. So which virtual machine sizes do you actually want to allow? And I can now go for sort of, some of the standard D3, V2, all the D3 sizes for that matter, and some other ones. And you'll notice that currently I've got 8 selected. If I hit the next button here, it's gonna prompt me for some remediation. Certain policies can even remediate the issue. For example, if I want the log analytics agent deployed, certain policies will look at the virtual machines to see are they compliant or not. And if they are not compliant, it will actually fix the problem, right? For me to be able to fix the problem with certain policies, I need some sort of a security principle to do that. And that's why we will say create the managed identity, and it'll then have its own identity, and that will give it permissions to go fix the problem. It's not going to fix the problem for virtual machine size SKUs. That's not what the idea is here. And in here, I can go and specify we do not allow any VM sizes except the whatever, right? The 3, or I think you get the idea, right? So this is essentially the compliance message that someone is going to get when they create a new virtual machine. They click review and create, and suddenly it comes back and it says, well, there's a policy that's not allowing you to do. This is the compliance message, and they'll see, oh, they're not allowed to use this. I need to use their size. And that allows my administrators to actually go back and say, well, if I change the size to a D3 virtual machine, then I'll be able to do my deployment, right? So make sure that these non-compliant messages are actually giving your administrators enough information so that they can remedy the situation and not come completely unstuck. And then you can see I can hit the next button, click on create, and it'll go and assign this. This virtual machine. It'll go and assign that virtual machine size policy to my environment. If I click on view all here, I'm hoping that I see it here. It should actually say not started. It might take a couple of seconds for that to actually pull in here. I'm not going to wait for it not to start, to appear here, but yeah, it will eventually appear in here. Currently, if I go and create a virtual machine and the policy is active and actually implemented, it takes sometimes 15 minutes for that to happen. When I go and create a new virtual machine, it'll actually stop me from deploying that virtual machine, right? It'll say, well, sorry, you cannot do that. Change the size, and then we will allow you to do that. So take a good look at this from a tooling perspective and realize that policies are your go-to tool to ensure that your resources are always deployed and the life cycle of your resource is in line with whatever you need to feel that you are compliant and to ensure that your governance policy is enforced inside the Azure environment. I'm going to go back to my definitions here. And I want you to take a look at just one last thing before I pop back onto the slide. So I've got this concept of a policy definition, right? And this is the lowest sort of common denominator for policy definitions, right? A policy definition has got mostly a one-to-one rule with the rule I'm trying to implement, right? So each of these policies is a rule completely on its own. If I, however, go into my definitions here and I look only at the policies, we'll talk about definitions in a bit, and I go and do a search for example, VM, I want you to notice that there's a huge amount of virtual machine policies, right? Audit VMs that do not use managed disks, that's a good example. VM builder templates should use private link. Audit VMs with a pending reboot. So when we're saying audit VMs, we're really saying report back on VMs that still need to reboot after a security patch or something like that. I want you to notice that there's a heck of a lot of these, right? So there's lots of them. Now you're probably going, well, is it not possible for me to take all my VM configurations and group them together and just do my assignment once? And that's exactly what initiatives allow you to do. So I can create an initiative definition allowing me to group together a bunch of policies, and I can do that assignment once for the initiative. This comes in very handy if you've got various environments, like let's say you've got a production environment, you might have a UAT environment, and you might have a test environment, right? UAT is actually test, but you know what I mean, right? Different environments. So then I can actually say, but my rules for my dev environment might be completely different from my rules for my production environment. My rules for my test environment might be completely different from my production and my UAT environment, right? How am I going to do that? Because if I've got 10 rules or 10 policies that I want to apply to my virtual machines, then if I've got 3 environments, that means I have to apply 30 policies, right? 30 assignments, and that might become messy in the portal. So what you might end up doing is you might create an initiative for my dev environment, an initiative for my UAT environment, and an initiative for my production environment, group all the policies under those initiatives and just do the assignment once. So it's going to give you a much clearer, much more concise sort of interface here when I go to my overview, as opposed to having, all of these. There you can see these are initiatives. And if I expand the list, all of these are actually individual policies. So each of these initiatives might actually have 10 or 12 different policies associated with it, right? So it's just comes down to a scaling scenario, right? As opposed to 30 assignments, now I just have 3 assignments because I'm assigning the initiative that groups together 10 policies. Okay, so just to this end, there is a one-to-many relationship between my initiatives and my policies. Okay, so that in essence is Azure Policy. Maybe spent a little bit more time than I wanted, but it's important that you understand this. This is a very powerful tool that will, at the very, very least, keep you consistent inside your Azure environment, right? Locations, for example, of where you deploy resources. You can add a policy that specifies our organization is in the UK. We are not going to allow resources to be deployed anywhere except in the UK. Policies can give you that capability. All right, so there's just an example of what the policy definition looks like. And you will see that it says the allowed locations. All right, and if I go back to my definitions here, I can actually drill down on one of those policies, and there you can see allowed locations. And if I scroll down to the bottom here, what I really want to show you is then there's an effect, right? The effect in this case is deny. I can also have an effect of just audit, which means as opposed to stopping someone from provisioning a resource in a different location, it is just going to come back and report back to say, well, Johan just deployed a resource outside of your region. Go jump on his head or something like that, right? So there's different types of effects we can have with these policies. Now, I also think that's quite important. All right, well, as Rav mentioned earlier on, we are still in the process of hoping that some of you register for the exam. And to that end, if you take this event code, right, 17969, then you can navigate to the URL that you'll get from that barcode. You can fill in your details, tell us what the event ID was, and this would effectively allow you to get 50% off the exam voucher if you've attended 5 out of the remaining 7 sessions from, I think, about 4 sessions ago. Right, so there's the code 17969. Remember that code. I might flash it up again before we end our session this afternoon. Evening, I guess it's already here in the UK. So scan the code, type in your details, and we will then give you some discount vouchers. All right, the second thing I wanted to touch on is role-based access control. Now, this is also a key part of your governance program, is to ensure that only the people that have the required permissions, only the people that need to have the right permissions have got those permissions. Myself and a couple of my colleagues have seen scenarios where customers realize that, oh, if I'm the owner of a resource, that means I can give someone else access. And that means that I can do anything I want. I can delete a resource, right? I can delete a lock on a resource, for example. Plus, I can delegate access to other people. So the right way of doing this is not giving people, owner permissions, because that means that the permissions you give to them can also get given to someone else. And you want to avoid that knock-on effect if you think about it like that, right? So the right type of permission to give actually is what's known as a contributor permission, right? These permissions are applied in the structure, and there's three components that make up role-based access control in Azure. First of all, we've got the who, right? That used to be a band, showing my age here. The who is the security principle. And the security principle might either be a user, it might be a group, or it might actually be an Azure service, right? We're not going to get into the details of the Azure services. If you're interested in that, you can go and search for the term managed identity. And managed identity is the process of actually giving my web application its own identity so the web application can connect to my database, just as an example, right? So we've got the security principle, that is essentially who I'm giving access to. And then we've got what's known as a role definition, right? The role definition, there's some baked-in role definitions like owner, contributor, reader. There's lots of them. If you go and do a search for role definitions in Azure, you'll find that there's a huge amount of these role definitions. But you can actually bring your own role definition and create a custom role definition that excludes certain permissions that certain other roles might have. Just as an example, you'll see the contributor role can basically do everything except delegate permissions, right? So create resources, delete resources. This allows me to go and create a custom role definition, and the custom role definition can then exclude certain things. There you can see not actions, right? So I can say actions star, which means anything. And then I can go and say not actions, meaning that everywhere where I had an asterisk there, which is a wildcard, I can say everything except delete, everything except write, everything except elevate. Okay, so you can actually take the role definitions or even create your own custom role definitions, and you can assign a security principle, a role definition at a specific area in the hierarchical structure and the scope that we spoke about. So the role definition is effectively the what part of, what can the person or the group or the service principal actually do. And then last but not least, we've got the where component. And the where component is essentially in the structure of ours down to a granular resource level that I can go and take the who, the security principle, take the what, the role definition, and assign the role to the security principle at the level in the scope. So if I give my user, contributor permissions at subscription level, these permissions will essentially inherit down to all the resource groups, will inherit down into the different resources inside of that. So think, for example, of folder permissions on Windows, just as an example, works in a very similar type of way, right? So you assign the permissions at a certain level, and the permissions will then inherit down that hierarchical structure that is essentially the Azure taxonomy in a way. Okay, so the who is the security principle, the what is the role definition, the where is this definition tied up to the security principle in the scope of the resources. Now I'm going to quickly jump back into Azure Active Directory here. And you'll notice that there's a section here called roles, all right? And this is a list of all the roles I've got in my environment currently. I want you to notice if I just scroll up and I do a search for password, right? I want you to notice that there's a user administrator. There is a password administrator, right? There's even a help desk administrator. There's an authentication policy administrator. So we've got a huge amount of roles in place currently. These roles should really address 19% of your requirements, right? In terms of a very granular, least privileged type sort of, a role assignment to ensure that your users can only do what you really want them to do and nothing more, okay? But if that is not sufficient, nothing is stopping you from creating a new role. And I can say that this is, let's say, password, or let's say lock delete. And you can see I can either clone a custom role, or I can start from scratch here. Lock delete. And if I click on permissions here, then you'll notice that all of the permissions that we've got inside of Azure, the very granular permissions, are actually available here, right? So I might be able to search for something like lock here, and there you can see, like this is for BitLocker keys, just as an example, right? If I search for something like, well, there's, just as an example, connectors. There's so many of them. Directory groups security basic update. Directory group security classification update. Group security create, right? So if I wanted to give someone just permissions to go and create groups, I just assign this permission. That is all that they will be able to do, is create groups, not delete groups, nothing else, just create groups, right? Or just delete groups, right? So segregating those different, those different roles might be a key part of your governance plan, right? Is to ensure that the people that create the groups are not the same people that delete the groups, right? So you can use this at quite a granular level to go and assign these permissions. And then eventually, when you are ready to go, and you've got your role definition, you can go into your resource or onto your resource group or wherever you want, and you can click on access control there, for example, and you can click on role assignments, and you can click on the add button and add a role assignment. Of course, this is in the portal. You can do all of this through PowerShell as well, or through the CLI, and you'll notice that there I can go and select the contributor permission. I can hit the next button and say who this is for, and specify my lab user, just as an example. Hit the next button and review and assign, and my lab user now has contributor permissions to my storage account. Okay, so role-based access control is a key part of your governance, and you should use this effectively to ensure that folks can only do what you want them to be able to do and nothing more, right? So ensure that the concept of least privilege is in play here. And that brings me to Azure Blueprints. And this is still part of the exam, but I believe that Blueprints is kind of almost on its way out, right? We are busy developing a new initiative that will eventually probably replace Blueprints, but it's still part of the certification. So I thought I'll have to cover this. I want you to think of everything we spoke about so far. We spoke about resources and the sprawl that sometimes happens. We spoke about policies, right? And the governance rules that you want in play to ensure things are deployed consistently. We also spoke about role-based access control, right? We also have spoken quite a bit about the resource groups and the structure, right, of the Azure environment. Blueprints are taking all of those things in consideration and allows me to create a blueprint of what my deployments must look like, and then provide an ongoing sort of connection between the deployed resources and the blueprint, allowing me to see, where things are different from what I essentially decided to deploy. So blueprints are cognizant and takes into consideration the types of resources and the templates that you might use to deploy those resources, all the different policies and initiatives that are required to keep those resources deployed in the way you need them, and then also the different roles that you might require to manage those resources and still stay compliant, right? And will eventually keep on auditing and tracking your different deployments in a certain way. I'm going to do a quick demo here. I'm going to go for blueprints, and you will notice that I've got some blueprint definitions. The easiest way for me to sort of explain this is to actually do a quick demo. I'm going to create a new blueprint, right? And I can either start with a blank blueprint, or I can go with one of these that are already in place for me. I want you to take a look at some of these blueprints. There's one for the ISO standards, right? Well, there's 3 for ISO. There's one for Swift, assign policies to specific Swift controls. There's a UK governance policy. There's a National Health Service for the UK blueprint here that I can leverage. There's stuff for the CAF Foundation, the Canada Federal PBMM, framework, Australian government ISM protected, framework. There's a whole lot of them, and this should give you an idea that blueprints can be used to ensure that your resources are compliant with some of these standards, and that is what we tend to use them for. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with a blank blueprint. I'm going to say that this is the POPIA option, which is essentially the South African Protection of Personal Information Act. Give it a proper description so everyone knows what it's for, right? I'm running out of the text here. And then you'll see I can specify a definition location. I'm just going to place it in my always on subscription. And then next you'll notice that I can actually go and add some artifacts. There you can see for my subscription, I can add the artifact type. There's a policy assignment. There's a resource group. If I go for policy assignment, I can go and say audit virtual machines without disaster recovery configured. Hit the add button. Add another artifact. A resource manager templates. I can go and browse and find a file, right? I should actually have a template here. Let me go for documents, content, mock, and there's my 104. It's not what I thought it was. Hey, come on, 104. New. Might be in 500 all files. So there's going to be at least a couple in here. So there's like, a specific file, for example. It's not the right one, but the point is I can go and specify in my blueprint what templates I want to use to deploy my resources. I can actually also go and specify the policies I want to govern those resources. And as you can see from here, I can actually go and specify what role assignments I want. I want contributor, right? At this level, at this point in time. So once I created this blueprint, I can actually go and I can save it as a draft if I wanted to, and I can then go and save this definition, and I can now go and deploy this blueprint based on these rules. And if I make changes to my resources, it is effectively going to allow me to report back to show which resources are not compliant with that. No, you still need to, this resource is different, for example. So it's exactly what it says. It's a blueprint, which is a plan for what you're planning to deploy and the configuration on how you want that to be managed from a policy and from a role-based access control perspective. And then I can actually go and assign, these blueprints. All right, I've got about 15 minutes left here, so I've got one more thing to quickly demo for you. So the last thing I want to demo is and talk about is resource locks. I've very often come across a scenario where folks have configured resources in Azure, takes them some time, and they finish the configuration, walk away from the deployment, and someone else comes in, doesn't understand why things are configured in a certain way, and they make changes, and suddenly something stops working. Or suddenly your cost goes through the roof. I had an example today on my developer training where we spoke about resource locks, and we were talking about Cosmos DB, right? Cosmos DB, if I can show this to you, I've seen scenarios where Cosmos DB is being used, and if I go for replicate data globally, then you'll notice it's very simple for me to actually just select that location, that location, that location, right? And if you were not familiar with Cosmos DB and what's actually going to happen if I hit the save button here, you might think, well, this is why the application is running so slowly. I'm talking from experience here. I've actually seen this happen. And if I've got like a 1 terabyte Cosmos DB database and I hit the save button here now, guess what's going to happen? Our Cosmos DB engine is going to be replicating your data to all those regions. So if a rookie comes in here and the rookie doesn't know what they are doing and they reckon, oh, this is the right thing to do right now, hit the save button, suddenly the cost goes through the roof for your Cosmos DB. Why? Because the rookie didn't really understand what the implication was of their configuration change. So you can avoid this by locking resources. I'm going to discard those changes. I don't want that to go nuts. So I can actually go and add a lock here, and you'll notice that the lock can say something like read only, and you can see that it can either be a read only or a delete lock for that matter. If I specify read only, then I can say this resource is completely configured. Do not make changes. Talk to Johan before you make changes. So I'm spamming it up a bit here. And then you can see, well, hang on for a second. It's a read-only lock. Thank you very much. And you can go and see there that, my word, this is a lock on the resource. So if I scroll back now to replicate data globally, then you'll notice if I make some changes here and hit the save button, it's bleating a bit. It's saying, whoa, 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 you cannot make this change because the resource is actually locked. So even though I've got the permissions to go into my resource locks and delete the locks, let me just refresh. There you can see there's a delete option. There's a delete option. I've deleted the lock now. Now I can go back and do that again. But it's a very sort of purposeful act that I've done now, right? I've went in and I deleted the lock. That is something that is going to be appearing in the audit log. I can see at that point in time, Johan Meiberg went and deleted the lock. So this was intentional, right? So it just gives you that extra hoop to jump through before you do something that might be catastrophic. Also, if I've got a script and I did not debug my script well enough, it stops certain things from just, for whatever reason, oops-a-daisies, we've gone and we've deleted this. Another good example of this is if you're running something like a VPN connection, or if you're running something like Azure Express Route, where there's some pretty complex configuration involved. You might have certificates that is doing part of your authentication and establishing the encrypted channel, just as an example, right? You don't want, once that connection is established, you don't want folks to go and mess around with that just willy-nilly because they've got permissions to do that. Place locks on your resources. There's a delete lock, which stops folks from deleting resources by mistake typically, and there's a read-only lock which stops them from making changes to the configuration and inherently also from deleting the resource. These locks can be deployed alongside your standard sort of deployments. So when you create a new deployment for example, your IoT infrastructure, and once it's configured correctly, you can place a lock on those resources. You can actually do this as part of your infrastructure as code initiative, and you can place these locks on resources. Something that I do quite a bit is I've got my let me just look for subscriptions here. There's my subscriptions, and I've got my training subscription, and under my training subscription I've got some resource groups, right? Cloud Shell resource group, just as an example, and you'll see the Cloud Shell resource group has got a lock on. Codespaces resource group doesn't have a lock. I can go and add it. Add a delete lock to that, and delete no more. Let's just show you another example quickly. There's Jazz 204 function application, a resource group, no locks. I'm going to add a lock there, delete and delete, just put a D in there. So what I do at the end of my week actually is there's my jfunc function. I'm just going to add a delete lock there as well. What I do at the end of my training week is I usually go into a PowerShell command. Let me just go for PowerShell here. And I delete all my resource groups that actually don't have locks on. So if I go for resource groups here, then I'm expecting to see my 204 resource group as well. Scroll down a bit, there is no lock on there. I'm just going to add a delete lock there. Right, so get AZ resource group. Oopsie. Here's a list of all the resource groups that I've got in this subscription. Let me just make that full screen, right? So what I do at the end of each week is I run this command, remove AZ resource group, and I run this. This is effectively going to enumerate all the resource groups, and it will delete all of them, except if there's a delete lock on the resource group, it's going to fail. So this will clear out my entire subscription with all the stuff that I don't want deleted. It's only doing that because I've got a delete lock on the resource group. So use these locks. It's a very effective way of ensuring that there are no mistakes made. When a mistake just slip in, make sure it's part of your process. And with that, I just want to summarize. We spoke about governance in the bigger scheme of things, that the bigger your Azure footprint, the more important your governance becomes with Sprawl and all these things. We spoke about policies that are essentially the granular level rules that you want to implement to ensure things are consistent. We also spoke about role-based access control, the specific permissions that you might implement in your environment. And then we lastly spoke about blueprints that includes the resources you're deploying, the different policies you want to govern those with, and the different permissions and RBAC that you want to ensure that the right permissions are in play. And we ended off talking about resource locks. Use all of these tools to ensure that essentially your Azure environment is governed in the way that you expect it to be governed and that you don't get any surprises. With that, I want to see if there are any questions. I hope that made sense for everyone.
Yes, so I'm going to start from the top. Right. First question is from Don Thomas. Can you be notified or pull an audit log of these events via API?
I apologize, but I'm not 100% sure what event specifically you were talking about, Don. If you can put something in the chat, I'm not sure. Are you talking about Are you talking about the events like someone deleted, for example, a resource lock? Because if that is what you're talking about, um, I think it'll be available via an API as well, but it will certainly be available via PowerShell and the CLI commands, right? And because it's available inside of the Azure Monitor, you'll certainly be able to even provide some custom reporting on that information. I hope that that at least answers your question to a certain degree. So I hope that's what you were talking about. I can't remember where roughly you were in terms of, I'm not sure where I was in the content when you asked the question, because there's lots of events that I spoke about in there. So I hope that made sense. So in essence, yes, it should be available for you to query like that through API.
Great. And the next question we have here is, can you create and design these policies through Bicep and then deploy it through pipeline?
So the policies themselves are not Bicep files. You might be able to do that, but I don't think you can. The policies themselves are JSON files, right? But yes, you can certainly deploy them via resource manager, via a resource manager type connection from your CI/CD pipeline. So yeah, that is possible.
Next question is, to what extent do we need to understand RBAC for AZ900?
Now, that's a good question, right? Actually, you don't have to. In fact, I don't think it's actually part of the content. The only reason why I made it part of the content today is, well, twofold. I don't think you can really have a governance conversation without talking about role-based access control and permissions, A. And B, it's almost impossible to explain blueprints if you haven't touched on RBAC, right? So I don't think RBAC is actually part of the exam in this sense, but it's because I just put it in there because it kind of rolls into blueprints. So I hope that answers the question. So no, you don't have to worry too much about RBAC. That's more from our administrator certification actually than from the Azure Fundamentals certification. So don't worry about that.
Next question is, at what level do you assign policies? I find it hard to manage when they are assigned at various levels.
Yeah, so this depends. And I know I sound like a real IT guy now, but it depends what you're trying to achieve. It depends how big your footprint is, and it depends how you are deploying your different resources, right? If you're a small company and you've got one subscription and you've got maybe 2 or 3 resource groups, you'll probably end up applying them per resource group. But if you're a larger organization and you've got multiple subscriptions and multiple management groups, even for that matter, you might want to apply it at a higher level. In fact, in most cases, you might apply some of them at a higher level and some of them at a lower level, right? A combination of the two. To come back to the question, you can apply them at management group level, subscription level, resource group level, and you can actually apply policies to individual resources as well by applying them at resource group level and providing filters. So I can go and apply a policy that specifies the policy must only be applied if the virtual machine name is VM1. So you can apply them at all levels in your structure, even down at individual resource level by using filters. But the reality is the answer really depends on how big and expansive your environment and how big your footprint is inside of Azure. Small scenarios, you're probably going to apply them lower in the structure, right? But the minute you've got like multiple management groups, multiple subscriptions, you're probably going to start applying those policies at a higher level. It just depends on that and a couple of other things. I hope that answered your question. There's nothing wrong with applying policies at different levels, because otherwise you are going to probably have a huge amount of exceptions, right? So if you say, for example, we're always applying policies at these levels, then you go, but then this area, we don't want this policy to be applied for whatever reason, right? It's going to it's going to mess around with my Kubernetes cluster. Well, then you have to add an exclusion. Whereas you might just say, well, we only need that for this resource group and just apply it to the resource group. So you must think of a horses for courses type approach here. You're probably not going to find a suitable way to do this consistently at the same level every single time without adding to your administrative sort of efforts, right? So you need to probably get used to doing this at multiple levels based on what you are trying to achieve. I hope that answered the question.
I think we're out of time, but we'll take one more last question. I'll show it up on the screen. Is there any policy where no one is allowed to do manual changes? Everything should go through pipeline.
No, because Azure policies are not cognizant of pipeline, right? Azure policies don't understand what your pipeline is. Your pipeline is going to work with a security principle. So if you want to stop that from happening, only give your pipeline security principle access to provision the resources. Remove access for everything else. So that is not a pipeline issue. That is not a policy issue. That is an RBAC issue. Remove access, remove contributor permissions for your other folks that are in the contributor roles, and just give your pipeline service account really the permissions to be able to deploy resources. It's not a policy issue. That's a RBAC issue. I hope that answered that question as well.
I think we're out of time, Johan. So I'm sorry, we can't take more questions.
That's all good. Ladies and gents, please ping me on LinkedIn or wherever if you have questions. I'm more than happy to take additional questions. Happy days.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you next week, same time, same day for episode 9.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Ciao, ciao.